So now I finished with this row's 20, and now I have to decrease on the 21st. So I'm going to pull up a loop and pull up another and crochet together. And now I'm going to remove the stitch marker again. So in the last row I decreased on the 21st stitch. This time I'm going to decrease on the 20th stitch. So I'm going to single crochet 19 stitches, and then on the 20th stitch I'm going to decrease. But first I'm going to replace my stitch marker. And then I'm going to continue. So I finished with 19 stitches, and on the 20th I'm going to pull up a loop, and then pull up a loop in the next, and then crochet together. And then I'm going to do another set of 19, and then do a decrease on the 20th stitch. So I finished another 19 stitches, and now I'm on the 20th stitch, so I'm going to decrease again. And now I'm going to continue to do this all the way around the row, and decrease every 20th stitch. So I finished with the last 19 of the row, and now I'm going to do the last decrease. Now I'm going to remove the stitch marker, and I'm going to keep on decreasing until the diameter of this part of the hat matches the diameter that I want the hat to fit. So I'm just going to continue to decrease. This time I'm going to go by 19, in the next by 18, in the next by 17, etc. So I finished with my last row of decrease at the bottom of the hat. This last row I decreased every 16th stitch. So I continued on until I was at the 16th stitch. And now that I've finished, I'm just going to do a row of slip stitches all the way around the base of the hat. So I've gotten to the end of my row of slip stitches. And now I'm just going to finish by cutting off the yarn. And I'm going to leave a long enough tail that I can sew it in. And now I'm just going to go back here to where I left this row of loops open. I'm going to take the end of my yarn, and I'm going to just start right at that first stitch. I'm going to pull up a loop, chain 2, and then I'm just going to single crochet all along these these open loops. I'm also going to make sure that I crochet in that first end as I go. And I'm just going to continue to single crochet until I get back to the beginning of the row. So I'm on the last stitch of my row, and I'm just going to continue to add length to the bottom of this hat. I'm going to go on for another 9 rows, and I'm just going to continue into that first stitch that I made. Also here I'm going to place my stitch marker just so that I can bear in mind where the beginning of the row is. And now I'm just going to increase the length of the hat by 9 more rows. So I've finished with the last stitch of my 9 rows of single crochet at the bottom of the hat, and as you can see, it's starting to look a lot more the shape that we want. So now I'm going to remove my stitch marker, and now I'm going to do a row of slip stitches all the way around, just like I did at the inside of the hat. So I've gotten to the last stitch of my slip stitch row, so I'm going to remove my stitch marker, and then I'm going to just slip stitch onto that first stitch, and then I'm going to cut away my yarn and pull the yarn through. And now I just have to sew in this end, and I have to make the spots to sew onto the outside of the hat. So the next thing I'm going to show you how to do is to make the spots. I'm going to use this blue yarn, but you could use any color that you want. I would suggest red, but I already have a red one, so I'm just using blue. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a magic circle, like I did at the beginning of the previous piece. So I'm going to loop the yarn around my fingers twice. I'm going to take my hook, and through the middle of those two loops, I'm going to pull up another loop and chain 2. And now this is going to count as my first stitch, so I'm going to crochet 5 more stitches on those loops. Okay, now that I've got my 6 stitches in total, I'm going to pull closed my magic circle. First I'm going to pull a little bit on the tail, and then I'm going to take my smaller loop and I'm going to close it from the end closest to the tail, pull it closed until that other loop seals completely, and then I'm going to close this other loop by pulling on the tail. And now I have a complete magic circle. And now I'm going to increase every stitch. So into that first chain that I made, I'm going to insert my hook, pull up a loop, and then single crochet. And then I'm going to increase by inserting my hook into that same stitch and single crocheting again. And I'm going to do that in every stitch all the way around. And before I continue, I'm going to take my stitch marker, which I'm still using my safety pin, and I'm going to go ahead and place it into that first stitch that I made in the first stitch to remember where my row begins. And I'm going to continue until I get back to that stitch marker. So I'm at my last increase, and for the next row I'm going to continue to increase, but this time I'm going to increase every second stitch. So first I'm going to remove my stitch marker, and then I'm going to insert my hook into that next stitch and single crochet once, and then into the next stitch, which is the second, I'm going to increase. So there's 1 and 2 single crochets in the same stitch. And I'm going to go back to that first stitch and insert my stitch marker. And I'm going to continue to increase this row all the way around until I get back to that stitch marker. So I'm at my last increase of the row. So I'm going to remove my stitch marker again. And for the next row, I'm going to increase every third stitch. So the first one has just 1 single crochet, second one just 1 single crochet, and the third one I'm going to add a second. So increase, and I'm going to put my stitch marker back in that first stitch. Okay. So I'm going to continue to increase all the way around the row until I get back to that stitch marker. So I finished my last increase of this row. So I'm going to remove my stitch marker again. And this time I'm going to increase every fourth stitch. So here's 1, 2. I'm going to put my stitch marker back really quickly. And now the third stitch. And on the fourth, I'm going to increase 1 and 2 stitches in that one. And now I'm going to continue to increase every 4 stitches until I get back to my stitch marker. So I finished with my last increase of this row, and now I'm going to increase every 5th stitch. So I'm going to take away my stitch marker. Put my stitch marker back onto the first stitch. And now every 5th stitch I'm going to increase. So there's the first one, second one, third one, 4, and now on the 5th stitch I'm going to add a stitch and then 1 more. So every 5 stitches I'm going to add an increase. 1, 2, 3, 4, and now on the 5th, 1 and 2. Okay, so I'm going to continue to do that all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I finished with my last increase of that row. I'm going to remove my stitch marker, and depending on how big you're making your hat, you might want to stop making your spot here if you're making it for like an infant size or something like that. But I'm going to make mine a few rows bigger, so I'm going to continue to increase. This row I'm going to increase by 6, the next by 7, and the next by 8, so on, until I reach the size that I like with the size that I'm making. 4, 5, and on the 6th stitch I'm going to add an increase. Okay, and I'm going to continue to do that all the way around, but first I'm going to place my stitch marker back. And also I'm going to try not to forget to change where my stitch marker goes every time that I go to a new row. So I'm going to continue to increase by 6, and in the next row I'll increase by 7s. So now I'm on the last increase of my last row. As you can see, I've finished the spot, and I finished increasing it, and my last row I increased every 8th stitch, so I'm just going to do my last increase. And now to finish this piece, I'm just going to do a row of slip stitches all the way around. So into every space on this row, I'm just going to pull up a loop and slip stitch. So now I'm on my last slip stitch. I'm just going to finish that slip stitch up, and then I'm going to cut my yarn, leaving a really long tail, so that I can sew the spot to the hat after. Now I have my first spot done, and now I just have to do that 4 more times.